In just the past month, there have been nearly 50,000 job cuts across the technology sector. Large and small tech companies went on a hiring spree over the past several years due to a demand for their products. Software and services surged with millions of people working remotely. However, even with all of the layoffs announced in recent weeks, most tech companies are still vastly larger than they were 3 years ago. Here's a look at some of the companies that have announced layoffs so far. Snap. The parent company of social media platform Snapchat said that it was letting go of 20% of its staff. Snap's staff has grown to more than 5,600 employees in recent years, and the company said at the time that even after laying off more than 1,000 people, its staff would be larger than it was a year earlier. Robinhood. The company, whose app helped bring a new generation of investors to the market, announced that it would reduce headcount by about 23%, or approximately 780 people. An earlier round of layoffs last year cut 9% of its workforce. Twitter. About half of the social media platform staff of 7,500 was let go after it was acquired by the billionaire CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk. Lyft. The ride-hailing service said it was cutting 13% of its workforce, almost 700 employees. Meta, the parent company of Facebook, laid off 11,000 people, about 13% of its workforce. Amazon. The e-commerce company said it must cut about 18,000 positions. That's just a fraction of its 1.5 million-strong global workforce. Salesforce. The company lays off 10% of its workforce, about 8,000 employees. Coinbase. The cryptocurrency trading platform cuts approximately 20% of its workforce, or about 950 jobs, in a second round of layoffs in less than a year. Microsoft. The software company said it will cut about 10,000 jobs, almost 5% of its workforce. Google. The search engine giant becomes the most recent in the industry to say it must adjust, saying 12,000 workers, or about 6% of its workforce, would be let go. Companies lay off employees during economic slowdowns as a way to reduce costs and maintain financial stability. During an economic slowdown, consumer demand and sales may decline, causing companies to face decreased revenue and profitability. To address this, they may turn to layoffs as a way to cut expenses and preserve cash flow. In some cases, layoffs may be necessary to align the company's workforce with the new economic reality and ensure its long-term viability. For example, if the demand for a company's products or services has declined permanently, the company may need to downsize its workforce to match the new demand. However, it is important to note that layoffs are often seen as a last resort, and companies may consider alternative cost-saving measures, such as reducing hours or salaries, cutting back on benefits, or outsourcing certain tasks, before resorting to layoffs. Companies with layoffs in 2023. Dell layoffs. 5% of workforce laid off, February, 2023. HubSpot layoffs. 7% of workforce laid off, February, 2023. PayPal layoffs. 7% of workforce laid off, February, 2023. IBM layoffs. 1.5% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Gemini layoffs. 10% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Yankee Candle layoffs. 13% of office workers laid off, January, 2023. 3M layoffs. Less than 1% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Spotify layoffs. 6% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Google, Alphabet, layoffs. 6% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Microsoft layoffs. 4 to 5% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Amazon layoffs. 1–2% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Carta layoffs. 10% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Coinbase layoffs. 20% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. DirecTV layoffs. 5–6% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Salesforce layoffs. 10% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Vimeo layoffs. 11% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Goldman Sachs layoffs. 8% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Compass layoffs. Size of layoffs not immediately known, January, 2023. Stitch Fix layoffs. 20% of workforce laid off, January, 2023. Companies with layoffs in 2022. Cisco layoffs. 5% of workforce laid off, December, 2022. DoorDash layoffs. 6% of workforce laid off, November, 2022. Candy Digital layoffs. 33% of workforce laid off, November, 2022. Redfin layoffs. 13% of workforce laid off, November, 2022. Amazon layoffs. 1% of workforce laid off beginning, November, 2022. Meta layoffs. 13% of workforce laid off, November, 2022. Twitter layoffs. 50% of workforce laid off, November, 2022. Zillow layoffs. 5% of workforce laid off, October, 2022. Peloton layoffs. 12% of workforce laid off, October, 2022. DocuSign layoffs. 9% of workforce laid off, September, 2022. Taboola layoffs. 6% of workforce laid off, September, 2022. Snapchat layoffs. 20% of workforce laid off, September, 2022. Outbrain layoffs. 3% of workforce laid off, July, 2022. Lyft layoffs. 2% of workforce laid off, July, 2022. The Mom Project layoffs. 15% of workforce laid off, July, 2022. OpenSea layoffs. 20% of workforce laid off, July, 2022. Substack layoffs. 14% of workforce laid off, June, 2022. Niantic layoffs. 8% of workforce laid off, June, 2022. Masterclass layoffs. 20% of workforce laid off, June, 2022. Bird layoffs. 23% of workforce laid off, June, 2022. Superhuman layoffs. 22% of workforce laid off, June, 2022. Cameo layoffs. 25% of workforce laid off, May, 2022. Robinhood layoffs. 9% of workforce laid off, April, 2022. Virgin Hyperloop layoffs. 50% of workforce laid off, February, 2022. Peloton layoffs. 20% of workforce laid off, February, 2022. Beachbody layoffs. 10% of workforce laid off, January, 2022. Laying off staff during an economic slowdown is a common business strategy, as companies look to cut costs and remain financially stable. However, it can have negative effects, such as damaging company morale, disrupting workflow, and damaging the company's reputation. Additionally, layoffs can also have negative consequences for the affected employees, such as decreased income and difficulty finding new employment. Companies are laying off employees recently for several reasons. Decreased demand. The pandemic has caused a significant decrease in consumer demand for many products and services, leading to a decline in sales and revenue for many companies. Remote work. The shift to remote work has made it possible for some companies to reduce their workforce, as they no longer need to maintain as much office space or pay for as many benefits. Supply chain disruptions. The pandemic has caused disruptions to global supply chains, leading to increased costs and decreased profitability for many companies. Uncertainty. The pandemic has created a high level of uncertainty in the economy, making it difficult for companies to plan and budget for the future. This has led some companies to lay off employees as a way to reduce costs and ensure their long-term viability. It is important to note that layoffs are often seen as a last resort, and companies may consider alternative cost-saving measures, such as reducing hours or salaries, cutting back on benefits, or outsourcing certain tasks, before resorting to layoffs. However, the specific circumstances of each company and the broader economic environment will determine the best course of action. Ultimately, whether layoffs are a good practice depends on the specific circumstances and priorities of the company. Some companies may prioritize financial stability and view layoffs as a necessary measure, while others may prioritize maintaining their workforce and look for alternative cost-saving measures. There are several alternatives to layoffs that companies can consider to reduce costs and maintain financial stability during an economic slowdown. Reducing hours. Companies can reduce the number of hours their employees work, which can lower labor costs without necessarily resulting in layoffs. Salary cuts. Companies can implement temporary or permanent salary cuts for employees, which can help reduce costs without the need for layoffs. Benefit reductions. Companies can also look at reducing non-wage benefits, such as health insurance or retirement benefits, which can reduce expenses. Early retirement incentives. Companies can offer early retirement incentives to encourage older employees to retire, which can reduce the size of the workforce. Temporary leave. Companies can also offer temporary leave options, such as sabbaticals or unpaid leave, which can reduce the size of the workforce in the short term. Outsourcing. Companies can consider outsourcing certain tasks or functions to reduce labor costs. Improving efficiency. Companies can focus on improving efficiency, such as streamlining processes or automating tasks, which can reduce the number of employees needed to complete work. It is important to note that each of these alternatives has its own advantages and disadvantages, and companies should carefully consider the impact on their employees and overall business before implementing any cost-saving measures. There are several economic theories that provide insights into how companies can reduce costs and maintain financial stability. Keynesian economics. According to this theory, government intervention, such as increased spending during economic slowdowns, can stimulate demand and help reduce the impact of economic slowdowns. Companies can also benefit from this by investing in research and development or marketing to increase consumer demand for their products or services. Austrian economics. This theory emphasizes the importance of reducing government intervention and allowing market forces to drive economic recovery. From this perspective, companies can reduce costs by cutting regulations, taxes, and subsidies, which can help create a more favorable business environment. Supply-side economics. This theory argues that reducing taxes and regulations, particularly on businesses, can increase economic growth by incentivizing businesses to invest, expand, and hire more employees. From this perspective, companies can reduce costs by taking advantage of favorable tax and regulatory policies. Lean production. This is a management philosophy that emphasizes reducing waste and improving efficiency in all aspects of a company's operations. Companies can reduce costs by implementing lean production principles, such as just-in-time inventory management and continuous improvement processes. It is important to note that each of these theories has its own strengths and weaknesses, and companies should consider the specific circumstances of their business and the broader economic environment before implementing any cost-saving measures. The impact of layoffs on society can be significant and widespread. Layoffs can lead to increased unemployment, which can result in a decrease in consumer spending and economic growth. This can have a ripple effect throughout the economy, as businesses that rely on consumer spending may also experience a decrease in sales and be forced to lay off their own employees. Additionally, layoffs can have social and emotional impacts on the individuals who are affected, such as decreased income, difficulty paying bills, and increased stress and anxiety. This can also lead to increased social and financial strain on their families and communities. Furthermore, when large numbers of people are laid off at once, it can also increase competition for limited job opportunities, leading to longer periods of unemployment and a decrease in workers' bargaining power. Tim Cook on Apple layoffs. Cook acknowledged that Apple has made changes to its spending and hiring plans due to broader economic conditions. The company, for instance, is managing costs very tightly and is curtailing hiring in certain areas, while continuing to hire in others. Cook went on to say that layoffs are a last resort kind of thing, and that the company would rather manage costs in other ways. "I view layoffs as a last resort kind of thing," Mr. Cook said. "You can never say never. We want to manage costs in other ways to the degree that we can." In conclusion, layoffs can have far-reaching impacts on both individuals and society as a whole, and should be approached with caution and careful consideration of their potential consequences. The impact of layoffs on society can be significant and widespread. Layoffs can lead to increased unemployment, which can result in a decrease in consumer spending and economic growth. This can have a ripple effect throughout the economy, as businesses that rely on consumer spending may also experience a decrease in sales and be forced to lay off their own employees. Additionally, layoffs can have social and emotional impacts on the individuals who are affected, such as decreased income, difficulty paying bills, and increased stress and anxiety. This can also lead to increased social and financial strain on their families and communities. Furthermore, when large numbers of people are laid off at once, it can also increase competition for limited job opportunities, leading to longer periods of unemployment and a decrease in workers' bargaining power. In conclusion, layoffs can have far-reaching impacts on both individuals and society as a whole, and should be approached with caution and careful consideration of their potential consequences. I request all management decision-makers to manage layoffs with lot of empathy and try avoiding this situation, if possible, through alternate ways of cost saving. Because you may need to hire the same lot of people in future, and this can happen, even with you. Thanks for watching. If you like this content, PLZ, like, share and subscribe, so that we can create similar content in future.